Welcome to this episode of Shoulder to Shoulder, a podcast where a pastor and a rabbi get to the heart of issues that matter to people of faith. I'm Pastor Doug Reed here with my friend, Rabbi Pesach Wolicki, and on this episode, we're going to have a conversation about a recent article I wrote in the Christian Post, and then we'll be joined by our friend, military and security expert Elliot Chodoff to talk about the latest happening in the Middle East. Before we jump into our conversation, please like our Facebook page and join our Facebook group, the Shoulder to Shoulder community, where you can interact with Pesach and me all week long. The best way to support this podcast is to go on over to Patreon, subscribe to Shoulder to Shoulder. For just $10 a month, you're helping bring this message of Shoulder to Shoulder to more and more people all around the world. As a thank you for your $10 subscription, you'll get exclusive access to chapter-by-chapter Bible study, beginning in Genesis chapter 1 from Rabbi Pesach and myself. So go on over to Patreon, subscribe to Shoulder for just $10 a month. We are grateful for our sponsor, Israel 365 News, which is the place for you to go and get your news and information before going to anyone else. Go on over to Israel365news.com to check out some of their articles, and be sure to read Rabbi Pesach and my columns. Pesach, each and every week, Israel 365 has incredible products and initiatives that they are supporting. What are we supporting here on Shoulder to Shoulder this week?
Well, we've been talking about a lot of charities and good causes lately, but what I think we all need to do is get plugged in to good information. We talk about it all the time about going to Israel 365 News, but I also want to alert everyone to, we talked about it before, Israel 365 Action, the organization that I lead, and that is a project of Israel 365, which is really all about equipping all of us with good information and good arguments, keeping our ear to the ground and letting you know what is actually going on so that you can defend Israel and advocate for Israel. So please go to Israel365action.com, Israel365action.com, and there you will have a very easy sign up, put in your name and your email address, and you'll get a weekly newsletter, which will keep you up to date on all the hottest topics that relate to Israel with important information. You'll also get access to all of the video clips of various interviews that I'm doing in different media outlets. So if you don't get enough of me on this podcast, you'll get it all there. But please go to Israel365action.com. We live in a time where every single one of us, whether it's in our social media or in our interactions, every one of us is on the front lines of the information war. And this is what it is. It is an information war. And Israel 365 Action is all about equipping you to be an effective combatant in the information war. So go to Israel365action.com and make sure that you are subscribed to our newsletter.
So important. So stop by there and make sure you do that. And speaking of the information war, Pesach, I wrote an article recently in the Christian Post that carried it last week, and it got some traction, and we're going to dive in and talk about it.
Oh, well, so wait a second. The Christian Post, if I remember correctly, you got hammered. You got attacked last time you wrote for them for, I guess being a Judaizer or rejecting too much Christian theology, because your argument against replacement theology was all based in the Hebrew Bible, in what Christians call the Old Testament. So I guess you rolled up your sleeves and were ready for more. So what did you write about this time?
So it's interesting because I try and pick the articles that I'm going to post thinking about the intended audience. And so if I'm going to write for the Christian Post, I'm trying to think with that end user in mind. It's not just about pontificating. I pontificate plenty. I have plenty of opportunity to do that on Sunday mornings and podcasting and other spheres. And so I was trying to be intentional. I actually wrote this article about 2 months ago, and I played with it a little bit, and I sat on it a little bit and just kind of let it marinate. But ultimately, I really wanted to make a case that from the New Testament, because the heat that I took last time, I wrote an article out of the book of Jeremiah that as long as the sun, moon, and stars are in place, God's going to have a covenant with Israel. And people took issue with that because, well, you're not taking into account the New Testament. Jesus is coming and he fulfills certain things, and therefore these things, and very replacement theology stuff. And that was I think we had something like 200 or 300 comments in the first 24 hours. And I would say most of them were from that standpoint. Because you didn't reference the New Testament, therefore I can disqualify what you wrote. So I said to myself, all right, I want to write from a New Testament perspective. If I'm going to put an article again in the Christian Post, I have to I'm just going to use New Testament.
Hold on, let me just interject here, especially because we have a lot of Jewish listeners as well. Could you just fill us in about a little bit about the Christian Post, who its audience is, and what significance it has as an outlet?
Yeah, so the Christian Post has several million subscribers, readers. It's all over the internet. It tends to, one of the arguments in Christendom is it tends to be maybe center left. It's not quite a conservative outlet of,
interesting,
Christian theology, but it does a pretty good job of spreading in the op-eds. They have people from all different perspectives, and they do a pretty good job in that department. But one of the cases that I think a lot of evangelicals and others make is that it tends to lean a little bit into the social gospel and into some of the kind of left-leaning spaces of Christendom.
Yes, so that's what you meant when you said you think about the audience, like Israel 365 news audience. Correct. You're preaching more to the converted in the Christian Zionist world, and here you have to make your case to the crowd.
Correct, and you have a lot of people in traditional kind of Christian churches, your Baptist, your Reformed style churches that are reading the Christian Post, and so I'm trying to write with that in mind, and so I laid out this argument previously in Jeremiah that I thought was pretty hermeneutically sound, pretty Loctite, but I got a lot of flack for it. And the biggest piece that I got was, well, you're not using the New Testament. Obviously, there are some things here in the New Testament that are significant that change the way we look at certain things in the Old Testament. So I said, I'm just going to make a case for Israel's inclusion, redemption, continued covenant from the book of Acts. The book of Acts is about the establishment of the church. It begins with Jesus' ascension into heaven and a conversation he has with his disciples that sets the tone for the entire rest of the book. And so in the very beginning of the book of Acts, Jesus has been we just came through Easter. He's been crucified, buried, resurrected, and he spends the days leading up to the day of Pentecost, up to the great feast of Pentecost, the Jewish feast that they were all celebrating together. And on the great day of the feast, this powerful encounter where we believe that God poured his Spirit out on 120 of his followers in the upper room and commissioned them to take his good news to the whole world. But in the beginning of all of that, before that whole event happens, Jesus spends 50 days hanging out with his disciples. They are taught, and they are with the fully resurrected Jesus on the earth. And if anybody should have had their theology correct and straight at that point, it should have been them. You're hanging out with, the resurrected Lord, and he's teaching you. And the very first question that's recorded in the book of Acts, as he's getting ready to ascend into heaven and these angels appear, the disciples ask him, Lord, is it at this time you're going to restore the kingdom to Israel? He's been teaching them for 50 days. And the best part is Jesus doesn't correct the question. Jesus answers the question by saying, it's not for you to know the times or season and when the Father's going to do that, essentially. He doesn't say, Israel's not important anymore. Don't you guys realize I've come? I've been teaching you the last 50 days. He doesn't say, I'm about to send you guys out and the church is going to replace Israel. Why are you asking such a silly question? He's been teaching them for 50 days in resurrected form. And the question they ask before he ascends, Lord, is it now that you're going to reestablish the kingdom and fulfill all the promises of the prophets? And he says, it's not for you to know the time. It's coming. He doesn't correct the premise. He doesn't correct anything else. And that's the way the book of Acts begins, is with these disciples who've been taught for 50 days by the resurrected Lord, asking him if he's going to restore the kingdom to Israel, and him not dismissing the question, saying, look, you got the question right, but the timing's wrong.
Well, wouldn't a supersessionist argue that Israel this is their whole argument, that in certain contexts, Israel really just means the church, And Jesus' ambiguous answer saying it's not for you to know the time could have been saying it's going to mean something else. I mean, I could see, let's put it this way. If I'm a supersessionist, you haven't checkmated me with your argument yet.
Correct. Sure. And I, in the comments to some of this, I saw some of those, they go and quote Paul and they go and quote a couple different other areas. But the very next thing that happens is Jesus ascends into heaven and the angels reaffirm to everyone that, hey, the same way that you're seeing him go, he's going to come back to this same place. So geographically, not only is the question and the premise correct, but then the next thing that happens is he ascends and the angels say, hey, this place is really important. He's coming back to this place. They tie him to a geography, not just historically, but in a future sense. So not just what he taught and where he was from and what, that Judaism happened to be the vehicle that God chose to use. No, he's coming back to this same location, to Jerusalem. And from here is going to, rule and reign and all that comes at the end of the book of Revelation. But the angels tie him to that. And then the very next thing is the day of Pentecost, a Jewish feast in a Jewish city with Jewish followers talking about a Jewish holiday. And God takes that day and makes it a special day for the church that ties it all the way back to the roots of the law and the Torah and everything that Moses established there on Mount Sinai during the day of Pentecost. And that theme carries for the next 28 chapters. When you get to the Jerusalem Council, when you get to in Acts 15 and several other places where Peter preaches and where other people preach, they continue to tie back to the promises of the prophet and all that God's going to do. There's never a moment in the book of Acts where, well, you know what, that Israel stuff, just forget it. We have a new thing that we're doing here. Even in Acts 10, when Peter has the dream that the Gentiles are going to come into the fold and are going to be included. He has this dream and God presents to him all of these unclean animals and tells him to eat. And he's absolutely appalled that God's telling him to do this. Why? Because he kept kosher, because he was Jewish. And to me, that's the thing that, as people read the text, so many Christians are, as we said on our last episode, are reading it and they're superimposing a modern theology onto an ancient text instead of letting the text say what it said and seeing it for what it is. And so there were so many of those little nuggets. And in 1,000 words, I couldn't give a dissertation on the 28 chapters of the book of Acts, but I tried to pull those little spots where it's like, guys, this is so obvious. Israel's included. It's all about the redemption. It's about coming back to Jerusalem. And so that's the case I made. It didn't get as much flack as the other ones, but there were several folks that shared it, was like, thank you. This was so helpful. I did get a lot more actual positive traction with it. And so
that's good.
I'm probably going to tackle and try and do it with a few more of the New Testament books, just because if that's what it takes to get people to spin and think differently. All right, if that's your argument against me using Zechariah or against me using Amos, okay, fine. Let's use your text and I'll prove it to you from there.
All this makes me think that, the whole argument that supersessionists make about how, the promises have been transferred and that the actual physical restoration of the Jewish people to the land of Israel is not actually going to happen, and that promise is no longer in force. And they then base it on all sorts of interpretations of verses in the New Testament and saying, well, this time it says Israel, it's actually referring to the church, and this time it's not, and when it says the land, it doesn't really mean the land. When it says the Jewish people, it doesn't, and these are all interpretations, and it all begs the question that the restoration of the Jewish people to the land of Israel is not just another prophecy. It's not just another promise. It is the through line of the entire Hebrew Bible. It is the most repeated prophecy by far in the entire Bible. It's kind of the story of the Bible over and over and over again. So, if you, instead of getting into the minutia of this or that interpretation of this or that verse, there's a big question that these guys can't really answer, which is, hold on a second. If the entire Hebrew Bible is saturated with this single promise being repeated over and over and over and over again, especially when you get into the prophets, just nonstop, if that was actually revoked, if God's intention with the coming of Jesus was to change that, don't you think that he would have expressed that explicitly at least once, just to say it outright, instead of leaving it up to disputed interpretations? Meaning, if like again, it's not just another prophecy. If that was being negated, don't you think he would have just come outright and said it? These promises no longer apply to the Jewish people. Just come out and say it, especially because you have all the passages in the writings of Paul that say just the opposite, as we know. We've talked about many times in the book of Romans. You have it in Ephesians as well. Where he actually kind of says that the Jews are, salvation is of the Jews and the grafting and all of that. Is God trying to be deceptive? It kind of begs the question. This is not about a particular interpretation, but it's like, why? In other words, the supersessionist would have to give a legitimate answer to that question. Okay, let's say you're right, that it was all revoked. Why didn't he tell us that?
Exactly.
And that's
and I think it's fascinating too when you get in another article I've had on the back burner for a little bit that I'll hopefully release at some point in the not too distant future, is when you get into these conversations with supersessionist replacement theology folks, you end up, all of the curses are literal and on Israel, and all of the blessings are applied to the church. And so it's very fascinating.
It's selective. It's selective replacement theology.
Right. In the same verse where God will say, this is going to happen to you if you don't do this, and then this will happen if you do this, we go, well, we're going to take that blessing. But the curse, the Jews obviously missed it. They get the curse. We're going to take the blessing. And you can see that repeated again and again and again. And I go, you can't, hermeneutically, you can't split a verse. You can't cut it in half and apply this half to these people and this half to those people. And so I'm working on an article on that as well, because I think if you're going to say that the curses are all there and they miss Jesus and therefore all of this is applied to them, well, then the blessings and the restoration have to be applied because they're literally in the same paragraph. They're in the same verses and context. You can't separate that and not say that the culmination then of all things is going to be their restoration and fulfillment and Israel established.
Yeah, Doug, between you writing that and the piece that I wrote in the Jerusalem Post about Catholics a few weeks ago, which got a lot of feedback. I got a lot of I was talking about why this new trend among what are called traditional Catholics who view them, who even reject Vatican II, who are now saying that the Jews of today aren't the Jews, and their whole temper tantrum that they're throwing. I think this all speaks to the big issue. And you and I have talked about this so many times. Every listener to this podcast has heard us talk about this, that there is, among the many upheavals that we're living through in our time, one of the things we're living through is a major existential crisis. For some, for others, it's beautiful and to be celebrated and sing hallelujah, but it's a major existential crisis for Christianity across all denominations. And the question of the Jews in Israel, because of how foundational it is in everything you're talking about. I mean, if you read the New Testament and the question of the relationship of Jews to Gentiles within the family of believers in Jesus is a fundamental central question. It's touched on throughout the New Testament, and how to understand which side of the argument you come down on and how to understand the relationship of Christians to the Jewish people. It strikes at the core of what it means to be a Christian, what it means to be someone who believes in Jesus. It's not just another theological question. And I think that the success of the state of Israel, the current state of affairs, and you see this, the way that this theological issue has become such a flashpoint in the political discourse right now really speaks to the fact that this is, and it's great that you're writing this about, with the New Testament. And Jerry McDermott, of course, wrote a whole book making a New Testament argument for Christian Zionism, which is very important. And there's others, Brad Young has done a lot of great work in this area, talking about the Jewishness of Paul and the Jewishness of Jesus. And these questions really they're not separated from the politics. And I don't know what it looks like on the other side of this, but there's clearly there have been other ruptures in the church since the time of Jesus. Judaism has had its own ruptures and splits throughout our history, where we've had breakaways, whether Sadducees, Pharisees is goes back to temple times, but there's been other ones. I think there's a major rupture in the church that is going on right now that we're just in the middle of. We're in the eye of the storm of, and here on this podcast, we are we're living on the front lines of that argument.
Absolutely. And I'm going to continue to write those things, which I believe, and I think it's important for the church to wrestle through that biblically. You can have your opinions, you can have your geopolitics, you can like Netanyahu, not like Netanyahu, but the Bible's the Bible. It's been that way for thousands of years, and our job is not to read our preferences into it, but it's to let the text speak. And I think that's so important for our Christian listeners, because we all have our opinions and we have the things that we've been raised in, but it's so important to go back to the heart and the language and the root of why God said what he said and did what he did, because it speaks to the character of God and the God that we claim to worship through Jesus. I want to know that God fully, truly, clearly, and the only way I can do that is through the text and allowing him to speak through that text.
Amen. Beautiful.
Well, there's lots going on in the world, and we have our friend joining us for a little update on the Middle East. I mean, I guess there's some things. There's not much to talk about in the Middle East. It's not like the entire U.S. Navy's there and all of that. But Pesach, why don't you bring Elliot on in and let's talk some Middle East conflict.
All right, to the shoulder-to-shoulder audience, obviously this man needs no introduction. Reserve Major Elliot Chodoff, who is also the host of Conflict Uncovered, a podcast you have to listen to if you really want to understand. If you're nerdy enough to really want to understand what's going on in the Middle East, you got to listen to Conflict Uncovered. Elliot is an expert in all things Middle East, including the history. He's been a lecturer in many, many contexts for a very long time. Many people rely on him, as do we. I don't know if I have to go through the whole bio every time, Elliot. But Elliot Chodoff. All right, welcome back to Shoulder to Shoulder. So, Elliot, we have now
to get back. Wait. Before you ask, I got to throw in my two. I have to put in my 2 cents on the end of the last conversation that I heard. I'll do it in like 2 sentences. I've studied anti-Semitism. I'm co-authoring a book on it. It's as usual, books take longer than planned. But one of the things that we have learned, my co-author and I, and have concluded, and this may actually speak to both what you, Doug, and what you, Pesach, were saying, is that anti-Semitism, Jew hatred, is the starting point, not the end point. In other words, if you start from there, you find all the explanations you want. And if it means splitting verses, if it means saying the Jews are simultaneously the bankers and the communists, or whatever it is that it just doesn't fit logically, you'd say, well, if I were using those to come to the conclusion of anti-Semitism, it wouldn't work. But if I start from hating the Jews, everything works.
No, that's a good point.
Yeah, and that's a very interesting point. A lot of what you're saying, Elliot, is actually very deep, which is that the cause and effect is reversed in people's minds. It's not because people have bad theology they hate the Jews. It's because they hate the Jews they develop bad theology.
Correct.
All right, Elliot, we're going to pivot to the Middle East. There's obviously a ton going on. And, I'm always pointing out that, Trump's unpredictability is a doctrine. It's something that he talked about ever since he first campaigned for president. There's a great speech he gave in April of 2016 where there's a whole section of the speech where he talks about the need when dealing with adversaries, not when dealing with everyone on the foreign stage, but when dealing with adversaries, there's a need to be unpredictable. It's clearly driving the Iranians nuts because they're used to being the sneaky, unpredictable ones who know how to negotiate their way out of a paper bag, and Trump is bamboozling them. And now we have a situation where Trump is trying to open the Straits of Hormuz, and then when the Iranians refuse, he says, okay, I'll just close them up myself. Tell us what's going on. Make us smart about what we're looking at downrange.
Okay, so first of all, I agree with you. For Trump, at least, the unpredictability is a method. I am not sure that the short-term erratic movement is method as much as it is personality, but the two go together. He's trying to do the impossible of the Yiddish phrase, you can't dance simultaneously at multiple weddings. He's trying to dance at multiple weddings simultaneously.
What do you mean?
Okay, so first of all, there's the Iran issue, and this comes back to what we were saying earlier about anti-Semitism. The anti-Semites will say, it's all about Israel. Let Israel do it itself. It's not our war. He's known for decades that Iran is an issue. He's on record for decades, and for good reason. And he's going after them now. This is for sure. At the same time, and he's beaten, along with Israel hand in hand, beaten them up badly. At the same time, he's facing domestic issues. He's got a midterm coming up. He's got a party that's split in part because of its anti-Semitic fringe, in part because of simple misunderstanding of international relations strategy and foreign policy. I'm very much in favor of the idea of not getting involved in endless wars, certainly not in wars that are fighting other people's battles when they have no impact on you. But the United States is a global power. It has interests around the world. And this idea that you can lock yourself up and shut the gates, so to speak, it's not a city-state of medieval times. And even then it was difficult to do it. So he's got a constituency that's not with him. He's trying to maintain a timetable that I say is I'm talking about a short-term timetable, a daily timetable that's affected by two totally irrelevant but critical factors. One is the CNN news cycle. And when I say CNN, I mean the whole fast food news business, all of them. And the other is the Dow, the Dow Jones Industrial Average. In other words, those two things are having a huge impact on his short-term decision-making. And we're seeing that as well. Now, there's stuff that's not clear. This 2 week, or maybe not 2 week, or we'll see, the Iranians rejected the offer. But the pause, if it was simply done to give the Iranians a chance to rethink, it was a strategic error. They are taking advantage of it. And there's an old saying in strategy, nothing good ever comes from a pause. And we've seen that here historically over and over again. On the other hand, and I don't know this, I've seen reports, but I have not confirmation, that the U.S. forces needed a break for a whole bunch of logistical personnel reasons and that sort of thing. If that's the reason, 100%, the right decision to make. Sometimes you do have to stop and take a breath and get everybody physically and logistically back online. So we're in this kind of middle space. I think he's surprised at the determination of the Iranians. Anybody who's familiar with radical ideologies, and I'm intentionally not saying radical Islamic, because radical ideology doesn't have to be religious and it doesn't have to be Islamic. C note Hitler, C note Imperial Japan. That you cannot convince them rationally to quit, because quitting is the end of them. In other words, you can't negotiate the Iranian leadership out of its position. It's death as far as they're concerned. And they're not giving in. You've also got, once again, radical ideological leadership, doesn't care about its population, doesn't care about its population's well-being. All those threats that would normally work in any sort of a system where the government has even an iota of sense of responsibility simply is not going to work here. So I think he and Witkoff and friends are still feeling their way on that, although they're learning for sure. But they're still going to try. And I'll finish this off with a sentence. And to a certain extent, it's good that they're trying. It would be nice to be able to negotiate this away. The problem is it won't work.
Yeah. So, Elliot, one of the refrains we're hearing in the media is that actually Israel and the U.S. is losing. This has been an absolute catastrophe. Give us a sense of what the military victories have been. What was Iran's capacity 2 months ago, and what is their capacity today? What has actually been done on the ground? What has been destroyed? What is the state of affairs in Iran?
All right, let me do this sort of layer by layer. First, the tactical operational. Their Navy no longer exists for all intents and purposes. It's reduced to a bunch of fast boats, which are dangerous in the Straits of Hormuz, but have no real value outside of there. What little air force they had no longer exists. What few air defenses were left after the previous campaigns are gone. And here, I just want to be clear on something. I'm speaking in military terms, not in absolute terms. Okay, so yes, they might have an occasional missile like the one that brought down the F-15 a couple of weeks ago. That's not a military threat. That's an offhanded, off-shot chance.
And apparently, it was also it was a mobile missile. It was a shoulder-held missile.
Right. So again, it's not zero, but in military terms, it's zero. If you're flying thousands of sorties a day, and you've been doing it for over a month, and one plane was shot down, and then the A-10 was damaged in the rescue operation. That's not military anti-aircraft capability. That's nowhere near that. So that's on that level. Their nuclear capabilities badly damaged in the earlier rounds, further damaged in this one. But that story is not over yet, which is why it's still a sticking point in negotiations. But it's a setback. I'll come back to the idea of setback in a moment because it's very important here as well. Their ballistic missile capability tremendously reduced, which is why what we saw in Israel up until the ceasefire, and if we go back to it, we're going to probably see it again next week, the week after, if things start up again, is once again, in military terms, harassment. Firing 2 or 3 missiles at Tel Aviv is harassment. That doesn't mean they're not dangerous, and it doesn't mean they don't cause damage if they get through, and when the pieces fall and cause casualties. But given that the first time around, they were firing between 80 and 100 missiles at a time, they don't have that. They can do it twice, 3 times. I don't know exactly how many they've got. But they can't do that with any sustainability. And what they would rather do, correctly, strategically, is fire 5 a day or 6 a day at Tel Aviv, Jerusalem, and Haifa, harass millions of Israelis in the process, and be able to do it essentially indefinitely. Because if they have 200 missiles, they can do that over a 2-month period and get away with it. And that shows how badly that's been damaged. Having said all of, and now, I'm sorry, one other layer, their production capability, military and I'll call it proto-military, has been heavily damaged. Military in the sense of missile production, drone production plants, missile fuel production, and so on. But proto-military, petrochemicals, metalwork, and that sort of thing, which are not exclusively military industries, but they are the primary industries that send the raw materials to the military industries. All of that has been very heavily damaged. Having said that, one of the things that was learned in World War II by the strategic bombing of Germany is that a country that's up and running can rebuild very, very quickly.
Yep. Yeah, that's where we look. This speaks to the whole question of, like you were saying before, how the Americans are learning, but they don't quite get it yet. And you know, Trump repeats like a mantra: they have no navy, they have no air defenses, we've destroyed them, we've defeated them, there's nothing left. And the Iranians, and they're not kidding, they're serious, really view this as a victory because the shooting stopped and they're still in power. because they don't care. Like you said, because they don't care about their people. And that's why I'm very skeptical about like, oh, we're going to start bombing their civilian infrastructure. Like they don't care. All they care about is that they remain in power. And that's why I think that's why I led this conversation with you, Elliot, with the Straits of Hormuz, because it seems, and I watch this very, very closely, and I make a point of reading Iranian state media every day, both Tasnim and Wana. I want to get, there's different state media outlets. Wana's a little more analytical. Tasnim is IRGC, newsletter. And they've been kind of, very smug the whole war. But with this Hormuz thing over the last 24 hours, they seem to be panicking. They're freaking out over this. And maybe we're finally seeing something that actually, like, let me say this another way. Our definition of victory can't ignore their definition of victory, or our definition of their defeat has to be consistent with how they would view it. And that's where I think the Americans aren't quite there yet.
First of all, absolutely, I agree with you. Let's keep in mind that closing the straits to Iranian shipping also is a swipe at China. There's a lot going on in that package. And if Iran can't supply China with oil, China has no use for Iran. So there's a lot going on there as well. I do want to come back to something that you mentioned, though. I think that the targeting of what's called civilian infrastructure, and I don't like that terminology because it's not purely civilian. It has other, there's been a lot about this, and I think it's important to say, bombing something that is purely civilian for the purpose of causing harm to the civilian population is a war crime. However, there are many things, particularly communications, transportation, infrastructure, which are multi-purpose. They include military. And here again, World War II provides all the great examples. In the months leading up to D-Day, the Allies bombed the French rail system to oblivion in order to be able to prevent the Germans from reinforcing the front in Normandy. So the rail system is ostensibly civilian, except that all major troop and logistics movement was done by rail. I'm looking at another element to this, and that is that by isolating areas of Iran, and here particularly bridges, because, if you take out a bridge, it's hard to go around. If you destroy a road, it can be filled in and made usable very, very quickly in relative terms. But by isolating segments of Iran from Tehran, it improves the chances of the hopeful uprising that hopefully will occur after all of this after the military aspects of this are over, and will make it very difficult for the IRGC and the Basij to get from one place to the other. It increases the chances that a local uprising, I'm making up places now, right, in Isfahan, for example, will not be put down because they won't be able to move force from Tehran to there. And I think that has a strategic value as well, but it's that's my projection analysis, not a prediction.
I wonder, it's been something I feel like since the beginning, whether it was Prime Minister Netanyahu or whether it was President Trump, telling people, hey, stay inside, we're coming, and we'll tell you when to come outside. And there were people trying to guess that Bibi was, telegraphing that hey, this Friday, you guys should come out and do your thing. And there was all kinds of speculation, and the pundits said what they were going to say. Do you see that as a viable end game here? Do you really feel like the Iranian people are going to rise up and take control of their country?
First of all, it's something I think we'd all like to see. Will they do it? Here, I'll give you the difficulties. First of all, I would be shocked.
Let me just add to the question. Before you finish answering. Will they do it without a ground operation by either the U.S. or the Israelis? Let's add that to the mix. Go ahead.
Okay, so I can't answer the will. I'll answer can. They can do it without a ground operation. Okay, and as a matter of fact, I would like to see it happen without a ground operation. I I think that what was done in both Iraq and Afghanistan, at least certainly in the follow-up, was disastrous. And it all falls under the category of what I call you broke it, you bought it. Okay. Now, again, America, the Allies did that to Germany in World War II. The Americans did it to Japan in World War II, but went in there saying, we broke it, we bought it, we're going to put it back together again, and we're going to own it until we put it back together again and give it back to you. Because that was way up front with occupation and occupation forces and the like. Here, the problem is that, and it's an analytical problem. I'm not questioning the moral issue here. I'll use Iraq as the bad model. It was, we're not doing this to conquer Iraq. We're doing to liberate the Iraqi people from the horrendous regime of Saddam Hussein, which is fine. That's wonderful. But once you've gotten rid of the regime, are you an occupier? The answer is yes, but no, but yes, but no. And that sort of unclear status leads to the merry mess that we saw there for the years after. The population needs to overthrow the government. Whether if it will it, the answer is I don't know. Here are pros and cons to the argument. There is no central opposition in Iran. Okay. Now, the good news to that is it means that the IRGC and the Basij have nobody to go after. On the other hand, so there's a resiliency. On the other hand, the absence of a coordinated, centralized opposition means that it's less powerful. It means that an uprising needs to have more spontaneity to it than I would like as a strategist. But as I said, but if it had been decapitated, that wouldn't help either. So there's a lot of variance here of I don't know, because what needs to happen now, in practical terms, is this mass that's known as the people needs to somehow coalesce and somehow get together and somehow rise up. Now, it's possible. It's not an impossibility. It's just harder to predict. It's the shift, I'll use American domestic terms, between a mob and a riot. Okay? At what point does a mob become a riot? There's a lot of literature. Nobody's got a really good answer to it. Okay? Because it's not something that's an organized demonstration that's driven. So that's number one. Number two is the question of will it succeed? And I think that part of what we're seeing in terms of the operations that were up until the ceasefire, both Israeli and American, was to weaken the regime, its infrastructure, its control infrastructure as much as possible, so that if, and hopefully when, there is an uprising, it has the greatest chance of success. Because I think I've mentioned it to you guys, and I'll say it again. One of Eliot's iron laws is that these things work when the rebels have more people willing to die than the regime is willing and able to kill. This regime is willing to kill everybody, and that means its ability to do it needs to be reduced below the level of the willingness to sacrifice of the people.
Can I throw one more thing in here? We haven't talked about the Gulf states. Saudi Arabia, Oman, all of them, UAE. And Turkey has started hitting the news with some things that Erdogan has said about them sending an army to Israel. And I've read a couple of different articles here, and yes, whether it's late night tweets or if he's getting his Trump on, or if he actually means what he's saying, I don't know. So what's happening with the Gulf states and Turkey and some of the other Muslim Arab countries?
Okay, the Gulf states have been convinced graphically that Iran is not only not their friend, but can't be trusted. By standing on the sidelines, they can't count on being left out of the picture. So they have become essentially enemies in practice as opposed to simply in potential. Leave Qatar aside for a moment. Qatar is a little more problematic, but having said that, in the mix from Kuwait all the way down to the Emirates and everybody in between. They see Iran and Saudi Arabia, of course, they see Iran as an active enemy. What they can do about it is extremely limited. They don't have real armies. They do have air forces, but they can't do it alone. And frankly, knowing the coordination level between the Israeli Air Force and the U.S. air powers, because here, let's also remember, the United States doesn't have just an air force. The United States has 4 air forces, and they don't normally talk to each other. So there's one level of coordination between branches. I'm overstating it, but not by much. Between branches of the United States, right? The Air Force, the Navy, the Army, and the Marine Corps, and the Israeli Air Force. Now, you've got to keep in mind, you've got hundreds upon hundreds upon hundreds of combat aircraft flying over this battle zone in small, relatively small groups. This is not World War II of 1,000 bomber raids sweeping in formation over Europe. This is groups of 2, 4, 6 planes zipping along at close to 1,000 miles per hour, and nobody shot at each other. Nobody's collided with each other. The only one was 2 American planes, because I think there was a coordination mess up on the planning side, on the air traffic side. It wasn't the pilot's fault. The coordination is incredible. It's superb. It's outstanding. I'm not a high grader. This is like, you can't say enough about it. Throwing Kuwaiti, Saudi, Emirati into the mix will cause more trouble than it's worth. Not because they're bad guys, but they don't have the punch to justify the risk of coordination.
Right. And what's needed by the Americans and the Israelis isn't more sets of hands. It's not like they're lacking in resources.
That's right.
We kind of have to wrap up, but I would, okay. I would suggest something that I actually heard from our good friend. He's been on the podcast many times, Dr. David Wormser, where he said, the one thing the Saudis probably could do without getting in the way of the Americans and the Israelis is deal with the Houthis.
Right. Yes, absolutely. Just one quick sentence, and because Turkey is a whole story in itself, Doug, you raised the question. Sure. Look, Erdogan is hardcore Muslim Brotherhood. He hates Israel. He has no great love for the West either, but he knows how to play the game because of NATO and America and all of that. And he's wooed Trump somehow as a result of that. But
I think this war might change that, though.
Danger. Fair enough. But I'm saying up until now, where we are. But he is hardcore, radical Islam Muslim Brotherhood, and that's all you need to know about where he's coming from.
Well, I know there's a ton more. We're going to continue to pray here on Shoulder to Shoulder. But as always, Elliot, we appreciate your expertise and encourage all of you to go over and check out Conflict Uncovered. You'll get all the inside scoop on the military operations and Elliot's insight. So thank you again, Elliot, for being with us. And thank you for listening to today's episode. If you enjoyed this episode, please like, rate, and share this podcast. Subscribe on Patreon. Come on over to Facebook, like our page, join our group, as we would love to connect with more and more of our Shoulder to Shoulder family. And we'll see you on our next episode.